And at that point, I go back to just really total uncertainty again. I'm kind of back to where I was in that first 10 days where I'm hearing a lot of intense information. And in fact, I talked to another specialist who's among the best in the world, and they reviewed my case, which is very kind of them. They looked at all the information, all of the scans. I talked to them. They said the course of treatment that Dana Farber, which is one of the top 3 cancer institutes in the world, they're like, this is absolutely the right thing to do. And also, there may come a time when nothing works. This is Andrew Vontz, and you're listening to Choose the Hard Way, the podcast about how hard things build stronger humans who have more fun. Hard things like having cancer. With over $1 trillion in transactions to date, blockchain.com is your trusted partner on your crypto journey, and they are the title sponsor here at Choose the Hard Way. Thank you, blockchain.com, for your partnership. And as always, I have behind me, yes, my Disruptors hammer, as well as my Lauf Utold. When I ride, I laugh. Why? Because they're the Apple of bike companies, and they simply make the best and coolest bikes. I'm looking forward to riding mine again when I get to the other side of my cancer treatment. I am 5 months into my cancer experience, and I have been busy getting well. I've been sharing about it on my Substack and on Instagram at HardwayPod. I've taken a little bit of a break from the podcast, but I am back. Thank you for all of your support and all of your questions during my treatment. Let's talk about it with Shannon Jones, who joined me on a previous episode to talk about what I learned from building and winding down the Better Lab. Shannon, welcome, and where can people find you?
Thanks for having me. They can find me on LinkedIn at W. Shannon Jones. They can find me on Substack at TranscendenCEO.com. They can find me at University of Colorado Boulder, wandering around pontificating, often to the annoyance of the students who have the misfortune of taking my classes. And they can find me chasing children around soccer fields, baseball fields, and occasionally ski slopes.
Fantastic. So Shannon, I invited you to come back on. I have not shared much about my cancer experience here on the Choose the Hard Way podcast. I've been talking about it a bit over on Beyond the Peloton, which I've been doing with Spencer pretty regularly since my cancer diagnosis and as I've gone through treatment. So I thought it would be great to just share a bit about what's happening, where we are, where we're headed, and answer some of the many questions that people have had as I've gone through this experience, which makes sense because I'm thinking of myself. Until I had cancer, I had no idea the answer to any of these questions. So here we are. Let's talk.
Let's talk. Before we get into it, is there any kind of overarching message, anything that you want to make sure to get off your chest before I start peppering you with questions about this experience?
I think that the most important thing, whether you have cancer or you're just doing something that's difficult, that's elective or non-elective, is be positive, be confident, show up, adapt, and keep going. I'm going to write about those topics more in the future. If I had to break it all down, I think that those are absolutely the most important things, which when I think about it are actually analogous and in fact identical to what we talked about when we talked about building the Better Lab. Mm-hmm. So here we are.
Awesome. Yeah, it's interesting. I think you started saying something. It's become your kind of signature phrase on Instagram since you've been in this battle or this experience about like every day that you're alive and breathing is a good day. And I think that's something you started saying in the wake of your diagnosis and throughout your treatment, but arguably it's true for everyone watching, whether or not they have cancer. It's just like, and I'm curious, did you perceive that to be true before this experience? Or is that something that has become a part of your understanding as a result of it?
Yeah, I think it's definitely something that I was connected to and aware of prior to the experience of having cancer, I also think that this experience has brought into greater focus the reality of that. And like everything in life, we all have theories about what something might be like before we do it. And then you actually experience the thing itself. And then you get to meet the reality of doing the thing. Mm-hmm. And I think that as I've had cancer and have gone through this experience, which has brought with it a tremendous degree of uncertainty, unpredictability, including in this moment right now, something that I continually work to cultivate is present moment awareness and consciousness that this is the only moment in which I'm alive, and all other moments may or may not happen. And I'm going to be cured of the cancer that I have, and I'm going to get past this experience. And equally, whoever you are, whatever you're doing, absolutely nothing is guaranteed in life. And I am soon going to be dropping another Shannon Jones episode with Dr. Steven Seiler, a previous guest. It's a really fun conversation about how to get the most out of VO2 max training for non-athletes like Shannon. And I'm kidding. Shannon was a two-sport D1 athlete. And once you listen to that episode, that great joke will make even more sense. And we spend so much of our lives, people who just broadly I would characterize as focused, engaged people that have a high degree of interest in, you know, whether it's human performance, longevity, their professional life. There's so many things that you're working to control, to optimize, you're strategizing, you're trying to apply the absolute best tactics. And also so much of life is a random walk, mm-hmm. and it's a roll of the dice. And we believe that we have control, and it makes sense to get the most out of life. I think in particular, when it comes to being kind to ourselves and to other people. And at the end of the day, you don't really have that much control, and mm-hmm. whatever seems certain and solid right now is sure to change. I mean, in fact, that's the core teaching of Buddhism, is that mm-hmm. everything changes, right? And mm-hmm. permanence is part of life. And I'm thinking about, I had apheresis recently, which was having my T cells collected to manufacture my custom genetic medicine that I'll be mm-hmm. getting in about a month's time down at Dana Farber Cancer Institute in Boston. And I was just talking to the nurse who was running that process, who was very friendly. And I just offhandedly mentioned that if you are born, you will die. And she said, wow, I never really thought about that. That's the reality. And it's something that we spend a lot of time avoiding thinking about. And it is the truth. Like that's what happens. If you're something that's alive, one day you will be dead.
True. I'm going to make a hard pivot toward some of the more foundational questions that I know a few I've had, and I know that you are routinely asked these. So I know that the folks out there in the audience, and even some folks close to you, are kind of curious about these things. So the first one, I'm curious, do you know how you got this cancer? Do you know where it came from and why you have been afflicted in this way?
The answer is I have no idea. There are many, many reasons someone may end up having the cancer that I have, which is diffuse large B-cell lymphoma. And there are an entire category of questions that, and when we're going to talk about some other topics here in a little while, including what have I learned or not learned from my 38 years as an endurance athlete and someone who's competed at various levels as an athlete, and how does that apply to this experience? Maybe I'll draw in one of those lessons right now, which is, control the controllables. And I just don't think there's any utility in thinking about or ruminating upon things over which you have no control. And how or why I have this cancer, I have no idea. And I find no utility in reflecting on either of those questions. And when they arise in my consciousness, I don't force them out. They simply, I just don't see any point or anything positive that will come out of reflecting on those questions. So I don't.
Okay. And the path to discovering your diagnosis, help us understand, what was that like? What were you experiencing? And then how did you ultimately realize that it was cancer that was causing this experience?
I discovered it much to my surprise. Well, maybe I'll start there. And right now it's August 21st, 2026. I've really been sick off and on since probably December 26th, 2025. I got a really severe respiratory tract infection after Christmas dinner with my family, my in-laws. My father-in-law was quite sick with the respiratory tract infection. I have young kids. We're inside all the time in Maine. It's very common just to get sick a lot in the winter. I ended up getting quite sick. Then in mid-January, I went to my annual physical, passed with flying colors. Everything looked fantastic, looked great. Shortly thereafter, I went to Tucson for the Abandon Your Family live cycling team camp with Jonathan Kaplan of Riding with JK and Spencer Martin of the Beyond the Peloton podcast. And in that period in January, as well as when we were in Tucson, I felt off. And for anyone out there who's an endurance athlete, efforts in zone 2 and up into zone 3, so endurance and tempo, felt totally normal. Trying to go above that, I felt oddly constrained in my effort. I felt that seemed normal to me coming off from having this pretty intense respiratory tract infection. I also started to feel normal though. I didn't quite feel sick. My performance suffered, and in particular, we climbed Mount Lemmon one day, which for me was a 2+ hour climb. Spencer, my buddy Dan Swenson, who was also down there with us, just absolutely smoked me, which didn't shock me. But I was just really struggling on the climb in a way that seemed quite unusual to me. I came back from that trip, and every day, typically, I didn't do this today because I'm too wiped out from having my 6th round of chemo, and I've just really been taking it easy. But typically, the way I start every day is at some point, I take my dogs on a walk. When I go on that walk, I wear my Go Ruck, typically, and I'm carrying 20 to 45 pounds, 365 days a year. Some days I'll deload because that makes sense and not bring my ruck. But most of the time I have a ruck, walk the dogs, and I only breathe through my nose because that activates your parasympathetic nervous system. And I walk at the highest pace I possibly can while nose breathing. And what I noticed was my speed just kept dropping and dropping. And between mid-February and mid-March, I just started to go through the cycle of getting sick over and over. And my breathing it felt physically constrained in a weird way. Again, I just thought, okay, I've got a respiratory tract infection that's not clearing. Just stuck with doing over-the-counter stuff. I will say I was doing a lot of like AIing what was going on.
Yep.
And also, I know a lot of physicians, you probably do as well. And I feel like most physicians, most of the time, just say, write it out. Mm-hmm. I feel like that's typically
it's probably nothing.
Yeah, like that's their advice to friends and family members, I feel like, and that's what they themselves do. And then we went on another trip to California to see my younger brother. I had started to feel a lot better. My fitness had seemed to increase. I had my bike with me. My power numbers were looking a little better. I was feeling more comfortable getting up into zone 4, like into some sweet spot stuff, but it still felt a bit off. I came back from that trip, and then I got another really bad respiratory tract infection. And actually, I'm forgetting this, but I had some kind of stomach flu when I was in California. Mm-hmm. So I just kept going through being sick over and over and over. And when I got back, I was having this same problem where when I would go out for my ruck in the morning, I kept noticing, man, it wasn't just that I felt sick. My breathing felt physically impinged. Mm-hmm. And then sometime in mid to late March, I noticed that I had a lump in my throat. If you're watching this on YouTube, it was kind of above my collarbone laterally. And I remember saying to my wife, hey, like I've got this bump in my throat. And I thought, okay, maybe I have a swollen lymph node. I don't know. Mm-hmm. And also at that time, I ended up getting what was probably a staph infection in my nose, which I don't know how that happened, but actually I do. It's probably from wearing cycling gloves and wiping my nose while riding on Swift, and some bacteria got in there. It had happened before. Yeah. So I had respiratory tract infection, this thing in my nose like started to glow red. So I ended up going to urgent care one weekend, and I saw a PA for it was like 90 seconds. I waited 2 hours. The PA came in, I explained what was going on, and they said, they gave me some kind of topical antibiotic for my nose. They said, it doesn't seem like you have pneumonia, but we'll start you on, I think they gave me penicillin. And I don't know if they even looked at, I may have mentioned that I had this nodule. They didn't even look at it. I left, and then that didn't resolve, and I ended up having really horrible stomach problems. So I finally contacted the doctor. I said, hey, I'm having really horrible stomach problems from the penicillin, and made an appointment. And then, as always happens, maybe like 2 days before the appointment, my stomach gets better. So I actually thought about not going to the appointment. Go to the appointment, doctor examines me. I mentioned I have this lump in my neck. I'm like, maybe it's a swollen lymph node. I don't know. And he kind of like palpates the nodule, goes and types some notes in his computer, and he says, I want you to go get a CAT scan and a chest x-ray as soon as possible. So now I'm like, okay, I'm kind of freaking out. I was like, this sounds weird. I'm like, well, what do you think it is? And he's like, he was very calm. He's a really good primary care physician. Just said, I just think we should check this out. And then once we have more information, we'll know. The way the medical system works, again, I think most people have experienced this. If you go to get any test or imaging, you're going to get the results before anyone contacts you. So the next day I go, I get this CAT scan, and I get the imaging report back. I dump it into ChatGPT, and it's like, you have 3 tumors and like you have cancer, basically. Yeah. This is before anybody's called me. Yeah. Then the doctor calls me and more or less says, yes, you have cancer. We don't know what this is. I had a tumor on my superior vena cava. So I had a tumor on my heart. I had a tumor on my trachea. And then I had a rather large tumor. I would characterize this as the size of let's say like 1.5 Italian sausages. That's how big this thing was. And it started in my mediastinum, which I had to look up. I didn't know what that was. It's a cavity between your lungs. So it started down, like vertically oriented, basically underneath my sternum. It came up and then went across my neck. And my PCP said, you need to see the oncologist tomorrow. I go to the oncologist the next day. He fills me in on what's going on. And this isn't like the pit or a medical drama on TV. It actually takes a while to figure out exactly what kind of cancer you have, which I didn't know at the time. I have a really excellent oncologist here locally, and I really appreciated the manner in which he helped me navigate this information. It was terrifying. I had no idea, though, what this was. They needed to do further testing, and they asked me if I wanted to see the imaging, and this goes back to, or it doesn't go back to, we're going to talk about this more in a minute. Throughout this whole process, one of my filters for information is, will this be useful for me? And is it going to help me maintain the mindset that I need to move towards a cure? Because even as soon as I'm getting this information, I'm thinking, okay, what's the next action we have to take, and what's the plan to cure whatever this is? While at the same time thinking, this is terrifying, and I'm now thinking about, am I going to die? Like, that's the first thing I think when I hear you have cancer. I'm thinking, am I going to die? The doctor walks through kind of a decision tree based on the information that we have. His best guess based on blood markers, the location of the tumors, his best guess was it was likely one of two types of cancer. Either, I may get this wrong, but I think the guesses were primary mediastinal or some type of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Based on that best guess, and medicine is an art and a science, and if you've been medicalized, you will understand this very quickly. And this is why there is not a cure for cancer, although there's some really promising treatments, including the mRNA vaccine that was announced this week for melanoma. There's a promising future. If they could know exactly what you had and cure it, cancer would not be discouraged that it is. Based on this information and the location of the tumors, and I didn't mention this, but the reason I was having difficulty breathing is because of the locations of those tumors, and in particular, the massive one, which went from my mediastinum under my sternum up and across my neck. It went all the way across. It displaced my carotid artery, and it was basically crushing my trachea and making it difficult for me to breathe. So that's why I was having difficulty breathing above zone 2. And I didn't mention this. The other thing that I had observed from looking at my biometric data was, which while going back to the Better Lab, it's not necessarily lab accurate. However, it's directionally useful if you look at it over a long period of time. Between January and at this point, it's around March 31st, I think, when I sit down with the oncologist and have this conversation, my Garmin VO2 max has dropped from 67 to 49. It's a rather significant drop.
Yeah. And you're training all the while.
Yeah, I'm training.
I mean,
I had
sick,
it.
But
at that point, I'd really dialed back high intensity training because it was just felt so weird.
Yeah.
And we have this meeting. Based on that information, the locations of the tumor, it's very clear to me this is exigent. It's impacting my airway, my heart, and they seemed quite concerned when I walked out of the office, and there was a lot of instruction around if you suddenly, if your airway is fully compressed and you can't breathe, go to the emergency room immediately. I'm just thinking, okay, this is pretty bad.
Yeah.
And then the plan was made for me to start chemotherapy first I had to go get a PET scan and a biopsy. That then began the sequence of tests to determine what type of cancer that I had. But basically, I was in chemo about a week after sitting down in this doctor's office, and they started with the most aggressive path based on the potential types of cancer I might have had. And that's how I ended up being hospitalized for 5 days in Portland, getting 96 straight hours of a chemo regimen called EPOCH-R, and that's kind of how things kicked off. Wow. So that's how I found out, and that was my introduction to cancer.
So for those who are not experienced in cancer diagnosis, cancer treatment, it's like you said something a few minutes ago. It was kind of shocking to me at the start of all of this. I mean, a tumor that big doesn't just show up overnight. It's been there, and you weren't feeling well. You went to get your physical, presumably had your blood panel done and all that. And the answer is like, you're fit as a fiddle. You've got a great VO2 max. You eat well, you sleep, you ride your bike, you walk your dogs with a ruck. You're doing all the stuff. How is it that they don't have any clue that there are these three masses, one constricting your trachea? Like, how do they not see that in a checkup?
Part of that has to do with the diagnosis I eventually get. I'll share about that first, and then I'll explain how that relates to why it wasn't there when I went in for the physical, because it likely was not there. At least that's the understanding that I have.
Really? Wow.
Yeah. And I go in for that first round of chemo. I had had the PET scan and the biopsy about a week prior. The cells from, I'm probably not using the right nomenclature. The biopsy had to go to the Mayo Clinic for testing to determine what type of cancer it was. And then it had to have further genetic testing. While I was in the hospital for that first round of chemo, I wrote about this in my Substack, which I recommend going to read if you want to learn about this in more detail. I ended up being in the hospital for 6 days. Again, once you become medicalized, which I have never been medicalized in my entire life. I had one surgery for which I was put under to reset a broken arm that hadn't set correctly. That's really the only time I'd ever been in a hospital. It takes a long time for things to happen. And I ended up being in the hospital for, I think, maybe 30 hours going through everything that had to happen before I could get the chemo.
Yeah.
And then 4 days later, they get the preliminary testing back from the Mayo Clinic. And I had diffuse large B-cell lymphoma, which was actually really good news. Diffuse large B-cell lymphoma is considered one of the most treatable and curable forms of cancer. However, it needed to go through further genetic testing to rule out that I had what's called the double or triple hit, which would have been double or triple mutations. If you have those, it makes treatment more difficult. I don't know like what the order of magnitude is. I think it's much more difficult is kind of my understanding. So that was a bit of a cliffhanger. But once I had that diagnosis and conferred with the oncologist, diffuse large B-cell lymphoma and the aggressive form, which is what I had, multiplies extremely rapidly. And for some reason, because it grows so rapidly, it's part of why you can kill it really rapidly, which is part of why it's highly treatable. That's a very non-scientific explanation. It's something like that. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not an oncologist, but that's my understanding is that's perhaps how it was not caught, because none of my blood markers, which would indicate I had cancer had I had it, it just didn't. It didn't indicate anything. And I actually feel really lucky. You know, it's weird. Luck is perhaps a peculiar term to use here. I could have had this and it could have been in some location in my body where I didn't notice anything physically other than feeling off. I may not have gone into the doctor. I may not have had this mass that I physically felt. And it could have proliferated and like spread a lot before I caught it. And because it was where it was located, which was not optimal, and it was like the primary tumor was massive. The doctors were extremely alarmed, is what I gathered. Yet it was somewhere where I noticed it. So that's kind of lucky.
I want to get into this choice of treatment because, you know, given how big it was, I have a visceral reaction about like, I mean, I'm not a surgeon and I'm definitely not an oncologist, but I have like a gut, like get it out.
Right.
But before we go there, I would like to understand, so you've described this roller coaster of not feeling well, not knowing why, not having answers, and then having an answer and it being potentially the answer having, you know, like mortal implication. And for a while, not really knowing, is it the good cancer, if there is such a thing, or the best of the bad, you know, which is luckily ultimately where or how they kind of defined. But you didn't know that. You didn't know if it was what it was. And even if it was large cell diffuse B, you know, whatever, you didn't know if you had those extra mutations, so you didn't know the probability. And you're being exposed to chemo, so now you're already emotionally like taxed. Now you're cognitively and just physiologically taxed. And you're having to sit in this circumstance where you don't know, and no one around you who's supposed to be able to tell you whether you're going to live or die. What's your strategy for? It just feels like any one of those like challenges would break a lot of people. And I know that you have not been, you know, like you're a human being. You've experienced a lot in this process, but it hasn't broken you. How have you withstood that?
In the absence of any positive signal or confirmatory evidence that there would be a solution, it was my belief that this would be cured. And that was all that I had. And I just went with what my body told me. And I didn't mention this. I conferred quite a bit with people from my Zen community, my Sangha, who have a lot of experience with illness and death. I'm lucky to have a number of people in my Sangha who work in end-of-life care, hospice, death and dying, and who have been around a lot of sick people. There's cancer in my family. My mother's a cancer survivor. There are numerous other people who've gone through cancer. And one of the things that I did while I was in this period of limbo before we knew what the thing was, like even before I'd gone in for chemo, because there was this period of time when I was getting the PET scan and the biopsy where the next piece of information literally could have been like, you're dead. Or some, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
like
you've got X number of days or months. Or
whatever.
Like this is it.
And I think by talking to people who have a lot of wisdom and skill around this, part of what arose in conversations with them was just ask your body what's going on and listen to what it says to you. And I remember I sat with my friend Lisa quite a bit, and I went on a hike with my friend Rob, and we were up on Bald Mountain, one of my favorite hikes, and we stopped. And yeah, one of the things he said was, hey, why don't you put your hand on this main mass and ask it, what is it? What message does that have for you? And honestly, just having this thing in my body that was choking me and choking the breath out of me and had it continue to proliferate would have killed me. Touching it was scary to me. And I really hadn't spent a lot of time tuning into this thing. I'd actively tried not to think about it. When the oncologist asked if I wanted to see the imaging, I said no. I still elect not to see imaging now, although I'll share more about some imaging was shared with me, and I can talk about that in a little bit. When I stopped and just spent a few moments and thought about what message does this tumor have for me, which I didn't know if there was going to be a message. It was one of the most striking experiences I've had in my entire life, because we kind of stood there and both were meditating and reflecting. And I put my hand on the mass, and within seconds, a very clear message came to me, almost like it was being written on a wall in front of me. And the message was, slow down, feel love, and let go. And it just was very clear to me that this was the message that this tumor and this experience was meant to bring to me. That doesn't mean that I haven't had many moments when I've been scared of dying or been terrified or completely hysterical or felt like I didn't have the capacity existentially, emotionally, as a human being to handle what I'm going through, as I've experienced the past 5 months. That message, though, was so clear to me. I don't know. There was just, it's okay, this is it. This is telling me something. And then I moved into the rest of the experience, and that was the most fundamental aspect of beginning to navigate it.
The other thing I'm interested to ask you about is it's really interesting to hear you say that prior to that moment, prompted by your friend Rob, to touch the mass, you'd kind of been, you didn't want to think about it, you didn't want to talk about it, to touch it, you didn't kind of want to, it's just but it is inside you. It is in your being. And sometimes, I don't know, and I have not experienced personally having cancer. I have people in my life who have. And it feels like on some level to me, it would be a very personal experience, because it's kind of you as your consciousness and this vessel that is your body. So it's it's you. But I know through stories you're spending time with Lisa, you're hiking with Rob, the members of your Sangha, and even the way you have been consistently communicating your experience through Substack, through social media, that this has been a part of this experience, and I think maybe a significant one, but I'd like to hear more about this. Part of your experience has been about a communal experience, or maybe even I'm guessing drawing energy from outside you. And I'm curious, has that influenced your ability to withstand and endure, and or what role has this kind of broader community played in your experience?
Yeah, community has played an incredibly powerful experience. I would talk first about a theory. In Zen and in Buddhism, there's a concept of inner being, and that's the concept that we have no self. We think that we have self. We think that we are an individual, and inner being is the idea that like, I'm you, you're me, we're the people who are listening to this. I'm the notebook in front of me. I'm the air that I'm breathing. I'm the water that's in my body. I'm the ocean. I'm a dolphin. I'm everything, which might sound pretty weird and woo-woo. And then the practice of that, as always, is more difficult than the concept. When I think about the practice of inner being, which can be powerful and also very difficult to embody, I think someone may come across me or my story and they may think, here's a 50-year-old guy with 2 young kids, an awesome wife, and like a great community. Like, poor him. And / thank God it's not me. I think that that's like a very natural and common reaction that people have. And then I think some people have the capacity to engage with and dialogue with people going through this level of existential and medical challenge, and other people have a really intense aversion to it, I think, because it just reminds them of their mortality and they don't have the capacity to engage with it. Both are fine. I don't think that I personally was highly skillful or had any idea how to engage with people who were experiencing illness like this, or had experienced death perhaps prior to actually being in this experience. Something that kind of, in a weird way, it just kind of makes me laugh sometimes, is I just think about if someone were to come across me or my story, or to hear about what I'm going through, the reality is, it's me today. It's all of us at some point. That doesn't mean I want to be experiencing this, but there's actually no separation between this experience and the suffering that I'm experiencing. And there's this particular vector of this cancer. There's some vector for everybody. Like, no one here gets out alive. And I think that part of what this experience has underscored for me is that all suffering arises when we see separation between ourselves and challenges that we face and other people. Because like, we're all here going through life. We all will become ill. We all will die. We all will be alone. Everyone that we love will become ill, will die, and will be alone. And I think, said perhaps beyond the scope of this conversation, but so much of what's happening in the world right now has to do with groups of people othering groups of people, turning them into marginalized outsider groups and directing hatred at them in order to accrue resources and power. And when we abstract away from the specifics, like, we're all human beings and we're all each other. I've gone beyond the scope of your question there. Yeah.
It's all right. It's all right. Well, let's circle back. You've got this thing here. Why don't you just cut it out? Like,
right.
Why can't you just do that? Why do you have to endure like all this crazy, people who've been following you on Insta will know there's all kinds of, cytokine storms and like just nuts stuff that have been the result of this miraculous treatment that is killing this stuff. But why can't we just cut to the chase and literally like...
Diffuse large B-cell lymphoma is a non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and it's a blood cancer. And what's going on is that there's a mutation in my T cells that causes this cancer. And you can't cut your blood out. And if you did, I guess actually you can. You can cut yourself and your blood will leave your body. You will get to your end much faster. There's no it would be whack-a-mole. You'd cut something out and then more stuff would come back in a different location until you address what's going on in your blood. And to get to where we're at today, we're 5 months into treatment. I've had 6 rounds of chemo. And what's happened since that initial round of EPOCH-R, I get the final diagnosis, which is DLBCL with no further mutations. That cancer has a 90% cure rate using a protocol called PULA-R-CHP. I shift to that protocol. And I'm talking about this like I'm going in to get an oil change and then you come out the next day, which is like, there's a whole other strain of this conversation. What's chemo like? Chemo fucking sucks. And
I mean, it's just like go look at your last few reels. If you want to just like in a distillation, what is chemo like? It's like my arm's burning off.
It's something new and different all the time. And we have the initial round of EPOCH-R, then we shift to PULA-R-CHP. I do 2 rounds of that. The standard is do a PET scan after 2 rounds. 90% of people experience a curative outcome from PULA-R-CHP. Okay, so I've done 2 rounds. This is my 3rd round in total of chemo. I go and get my PET scan. It's very hard to calibrate when I had this mass in my neck, right? And you're also getting massive doses of steroids. Not like, cool, you're going to turn into Sylvester Stallone or Dolph Lundgren type steroids, which I've never taken performance enhancing drugs. I've just taken drugs that get me to kill cancer.
Yeah.
But steroids have strong anti-inflammatory effects, at least the ones that they gave me as part of the pre-medications. When you get chemo is chemotherapy. It's really chemotoxin. It kills cancer and everything else. And there's a lifetime limit on how much you can get of most chemotherapies. Because if they just gave it to you all at once or kept giving it to you, you would die. And I get this PET scan, comes back, and then I go down to the Dana Farber Cancer Institute to meet the specialist there in DLBCL. I've had some reduction in my smaller masses. It was, I think, a 30% to 70% reduction, which was great. And then in the big mass, it was a 20% reduction in the SUV, which is the amount of cancer in the mass. And physically, it really hadn't changed at all. And I tried to avoid palpating it all the time and thinking about it. It's kind of hard when you have a thing that's like giving you a rear naked choke 24 hours a day and you're just sitting around thinking positive things and like, this is going to go away. The reality is it wasn't going away. The doctor gave me the hard news, which was, this is somewhat diminished. It's not diminished enough that we consider this curative. And if we continue on this course of treatment, like it won't work.
Yeah.
It won't work means you're going to die, right?
You're going to die.
Yeah. That was a real kick in the balls. And then at that point, there was a 2nd-line treatment, which he outlined, which included a new course of chemo and immunotherapy. And then following that, a genetic therapy called CAR-T. He like maps everything out on a piece of paper. I basically was in shock at that point, couldn't really process anything. And also, all you can do in the absence of any positive, well, actually, there was positive information, because the reality is we had some reduction in SUV and the amount of cancer, and it could have increased, and I could have had masses in other places. Like, that didn't happen. It was just described to me as like, imagine 2 fists pushing on each other as hard as they can. Like, that's the fight going on inside. The cancer is continuing to proliferate, and now we have to change. I get this information, and I know 90% of people in this situation are getting a cure. And at the point that I was at, most of them had a massive reduction in their masses. Right. And also, like, it didn't matter. that was the reality of the situation. And what I then had to do was remain confident and positive and go forward. And the way that I thought about it, going back to the idea that medicine is an art and a science, I thought of myself as a lock, or my cancer as a lock. And all we needed to do was find the right key. And I just thought, okay, we've tried 2 keys. They were not the right key. This is like an episode of Scooby-Doo. Now we're going to get the right key and we're going to solve the mystery and it's going to work out. And at that point, I go back to just really total uncertainty again. So I'm kind of back to where I was in that first 10 days where I'm hearing a lot of intense information. And in fact, I talked to another specialist who's among the best in the world, and they reviewed my case, which is very kind of them. They looked at all the information, all of the scans. I talked to them. They said the course of treatment that Dana Farber, which is one of the top 3 cancer institutes in the world, they're like, this is absolutely the right thing to do. And also, there may come a time when nothing works. That was not helpful or useful information for me to hear. I wish I had not heard it. And that was one of the toughest moments I've had in this entire journey. And also, it didn't matter. And I just, again, it's like, okay, I have to push this out of my consciousness. I have to listen to what my body has told me. And I have to move forward. Being a cancer patient going through chemo, your body is like an oven. And then these treatments, it's almost like sorcerers who have a spell or a recipe, and then they're baking this cake that's the spell in your body. And then you have to wait a pretty long period of time to find out whether or not it works. In this 4th round of chemo, it's so intense that typically, most of my treatments, it's kind of all at once. With this, they had to do 1 day of chemo that was 8 hours, a second day of chemo that was 6 hours. Then a week later, I was hospitalized for an immunotherapy. I had my cytokine release storm, one of the most intense physical experiences I've ever had, which is pretty terrifying. I was in the hospital for 5 days for that treatment. The following week, I had to go back to the hospital again for another dose of the same drug. At that point, it's been 3.5 weeks. The following week, I go to an infusion center to then have everything that I'd had in the previous month in one sitting. That's the 5th round. But after that 4th round, I noticed that physically, my main tumor started to shrink. It felt like it was shrinking like quite a bit, and its texture felt different. And that also was very strange, because then I started thinking like, well, is it enough? Am I actually correct? Palpating that something is not the same as having a scan. And there was more uncertainty. I got that 5th round. And then about a week after that 5th round, I got PET scanned and went back to have the oncologist review it, obviously. And that was when I got imaging through Epic, MyChart, because the oncologist was so excited about the massive reduction that had occurred, and that we had almost completely eliminated the main mass. We may have even have completely eliminated it for reasons that I can share. And the 2 smaller masses were completely gone. That was great news. It was really the best possible outcome we could have gotten. And that's where we were at then going into this 6th round, which I just did this week. So that's where we're at today, which is we're in a really really the ideal position. This is the best position we could be in coming out of this protocol, which is called GemOx GlowFit. And the objective of this treatment is to completely eliminate the cancer load and like get rid of the masses, going into the genetic therapy where you're injected with your own T cells, which have been gene edited to attack the specific receptors and the type of cancer that you have. In my case, DLBCL, and receptor 19 is the specific receptor that gets attacked. And these new T cells proliferate and take over your entire immune system. So that's what's coming next in September, which is about a 3-week process. And so we're in a really good position, and equally, this is an art and a science, and it's not done. This isn't a fait accompli, you know? Yeah. So there's still a lot of uncertainty. And with every phase of this experience, including the treatments that I've done as part of GemOx GlowFit, there's just like a lot of sustained physical discomfort and pain that I can't really analogize to other things I've experienced in life before. And equally, you know, something people around me have told me at times when it's actually been valuable is, hey, it could be worse. And it certainly could. Like there are many people who have a much rougher ride through chemo and much more intensive treatments than I've had. And what I've learned is simply slowing down and being still when it's the most intense is the most important thing to do. And if people have followed this and my Substack, or in particular on Instagram, during each of these chemo cycles, I've shared at times the intensity of the side effects and that I'm wiped out. And equally, I've also shared, you know, like in the last 2 rounds, I've been able to do, and throughout this, actually, the doctors have said, hey, be as physically active as you feel able to do, / like, don't go out and do VO2 max training. Like, you don't need to do that right now.
Right.
There's nothing is going to happen that's like going to build my fitness. This is about keeping my body in the best possible shape to take as much punishment as it can while we go through these treatments. But I've been physically active, and it would be misguided to conflate that with, you know, like actually training, or that I have some sustained level of feeling good. That's just simply not what's happening.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's probably a whole distinct podcast about going back to some of the things that, you know, a chart being shared that you don't want to see, a comment being made that is, you know, no doubt is being made in an attempt to be as communicative, in an attempt to be helpful, but nonetheless is, you know, it's a gut-wrenching comment. Or, you know, there have been a number of these throughout your experience, interactions with medical professionals who say something that's not helpful at the exact wrong time, or who communicate to you in a fashion that is no doubt governed by policy and legality, but nonetheless utterly removes, you know, like any concept of how a human would hope to experience this, or how you could help a human experience it. So I don't want to dwell on it, but like, I feel like there's a book to be written or a different podcast to be produced. Just, it's all about that. This dance between, you know, transparency and legality and humanity. Because it feels to me like there's been this consistent experience for you where the people who know the most and are caring for you also have a great tendency to consistently like jump over that line and say the thing or share the thing that makes it harder emotionally for you. But I'll digress.
Well, I do want to note that, yes, I agree with all of that. What it's made me think about is, for myself and for everyone, how powerful our speech is. In Buddhism, there's a concept of right speech, and you can say something that needs to be said. And again, in medicine, a lot of what's communicated is circumscribed by liability, like legal liability. There are a lot of things that you have to be told. Like, for example, there's a process called consent to treat. As part of consent to treat, with every treatment that I've had, they sit you down with a gigantic, I probably have 10 of these in this room. It's a giant legal document, and it tells you every bad thing that can go wrong. And it's stuff like you could go into a coma, you could have organ failure, or you could have seizures, you could die for a variety of reasons. You have a 1 in 2 million chance of getting HIV if you have a blood transfusion. That was a new one. That actually seems like a much higher probability than I would think.
Yeah.
The doctor was like, this is actually, it's like, we're really good at this now, but there is a 1 in 2 million chance. That was somewhat surprising to me. I thought it'd be a much smaller odd of that happening. That's what they have to do for legal reasons. And what it's made me think about, I'm a communication professional. That's what I do with One Real Voice, is I train people who are world-class leaders in unscripted communication in high-stress, high-consequence environments. Medicine does not prioritize communication. I've also met many medical practitioners, doctors, nurses, PAs, assistants, who are really good at it, and some are not. And the people who tend to be least good at it have to use a lot of their cognitive load probably in other areas of their job. Their interactions with patients tend to be quite short, and it's likely something in which they've received minimal or no training. I think that there's an opportunity for them to receive some training. And then I don't control that. It's something I might explore in the future. And then it's just made me think about my own communication, which I think about quite a bit with people around me. And I certainly have gotten a lot of feedback during this process, especially during moments of high emotional intensity and uncertainty, that I'm just being a complete asshole. There are a couple of people close to me, my wife, my family of origin, who have shared that with me. And there are times when, I would agree with them. And also, we all have to give each other grace. We have to give ourselves grace, and then move on and use that as an opportunity to think about how we might communicate in a way that's truthful and also more kind, that helps people suffer less versus causing greater suffering. So that's just something that I've thought about a lot. And, Shannon, I've continued to work throughout this process. I'm still podcasting, obviously. I'm writing, and I'm continuing to work through my consultancy with my really amazing clients. And in a lot of ways, I think that this experience has tremendously increased my efficacy and capacity to help the people that I work with. And I'm really grateful for that. And I'm grateful to get to do something that I really love doing. So that's been something really enjoyable as I've moved through this experience.
Awesome. I guess one last question before we wrap. Given the broad themes that this podcast is known for covering, and the guests who have frequented your show, it's only natural that we take a more specific athletic angle to this. And I remember when you first shared with me the news of your diagnosis, I had this visceral reaction, born of my own ignorance and my love for you, that if I had to choose somebody, and obviously I never would, but if I had to choose somebody to endure something like this, it'd be you. And the reason I thought that is because in some ways you have always felt like a maniac to me in terms of your tolerance to expose yourself by choice to discomfort and what most people would perceive to be forms of suffering that are unreasonable. And while cancer is not your choice, your method for navigating cancer has been your choice. And I see a number of parallels between what I've observed of you over the years as someone who trains intensely and endures. And I'm curious, like, how does your form of being an athlete, has it prepared you for this? Is there a relationship between all of those choices and the choices you've made in the middle of this?
I've thought about this question frequently during the last 8 years as I've had this bigger and bigger data set of guests. And then really over the last 30 years as a journalist, as an executive, as a consultant, and as an athlete, I've been really lucky to get to spend time with many people who are the very best in the world across the arts, sport, business, public service. Something that I've observed over and over is that what makes people truly exceptional or world-class in a highly specialized area often does not have a high degree of transferability into more common domains of life.
Mm-hmm.
I often think about, like, let's take The Dark Wizard, for example, for anyone who's seen the series about Dean Potter on HBO, which I'm actually going to be doing an episode about here on Choose the Hard Way because I thought it was so interesting. Dean Potter, one of the very best rock climbers in the world during his era, wingsuit flyer, base jumper, pioneer. Outside of the domains where he was operating as an athlete, had a really challenging time as a human being. And the thing that I think about is, I don't know, they're in the SAS, they're a commando, they're the CEO of a Fortune 50 company, they're somebody who's won a Super Bowl. What do they do when their baby wakes up in the middle of the night puking and they have some life-changing career thing happening the next day? They're late for work and somebody cuts them off in traffic, things like that. And to bring it back to myself, I certainly, I'm not a Super Bowl champion, and I've had a modest level of success as an amateur athlete. However, preparing for and competing in athletic events and kind of continually pushing myself into new frontiers as a professional, it's just how I've operated my entire life. Being in those arenas has not necessarily made me better at experiencing cancer. I will say, though, that the systems that I have used and the principles that I draw upon to navigate those experiences, and in particular, meditation, mindfulness, my Zen practice, and just the absolutely incredible community of family, friends that I am so lucky to have around me, have been indispensable as I've navigated my experience of cancer. And I think there actually are aspects of the athletic experience, training and competition that I have very consciously applied to the experience that I'm having that have been tremendously helpful. And I think they're only helpful because I have worked to cultivate mindfulness. And I'm not saying like I'm some super mindful person. I'm just saying the work that I put in that domain, the community I surround myself with, how I spend my time with the inputs that I have, whether it's friends, family, content that I consume, have all really helped to inform how I've navigated this experience. And, you know, one thing that I jotted down when I was thinking about what we were going to talk about today was actually an aphorism from Dan John, the strength and conditioning coach. And I'm a huge fan of Dan John, just as a philosopher and public thinker. I like his strength and conditioning work as well. Something that Dan John says is keep the goal the goal. As I've gone through this experience, the goal is to cure this and to return to full health. And any inputs that are not aligned with that, I disregard. And that's just one strategy. Similarly, there's a lot I learned from working with Jen Lebrecq, who's the behavioral psychologist who was an advisor to the Better Lab, my startup. And I've been a student of and have just consumed a lot of information about behavioral psychology my entire adult life. But something specific that I picked up from Jen was this idea of implementation intentions, which are different from goals. An implementation intention is having a plan ahead of time for how you will handle an obstacle you believe will arise when you have a goal you seek to achieve. So for example, I just knew that there would be many times in a day, in a moment, in a week, in a month, over the course of this entire experience, and even on the other side of it, because once I get to the other side of my CAR-T, I believe that my PET scan is going to be clean and I will have no cancer. And also, as anyone who has had a friend or family member who has had cancer, who has navigated cancer themselves, this is something that you're checking for years to come, and you're having PET scan after PET scan. And that's something that I'm going to be dealing with for a long time. And with implementation intentions, you know, I've just tried to think ahead of time when I hit obstacle X or I have doubt Y, like, what am I going to do? And there's something very specific I've done with the management of time, which is just to chunk down over and over and over. So when any increment of uncertainty over time is too great, I just chunk it down and think about, okay, if today is too overwhelming, or if waiting, you know, during that period of waiting when it was, well, which type of cancer am I going to have? Or I think about when I was in the hospital for 6 days, when I was getting EPOCH-R initially, where a lot of things physically happened that I did not feel I physically had the capacity to endure. Or when I had my cytokine release storm, or there was a moment here in my house when I was on the couch after a treatment and it became so physically overwhelming that I just had this thought of, like, I can't fucking do this for 6 months. There's no fucking way I can endure the physical pain that I'm experiencing right now. And what I kept doing was just chunking down. And in that moment, it got as small as I know that I can take a breath. So I just kept thinking about like next breath, next breath, next breath, and counting my breaths to 10 over and over. And that's a technique that I've used to get through the absolute hardest moments of this experience, when zooming out any more than taking my next breath was something I just existentially and mentally and emotionally didn't have the capacity to handle, because I couldn't imagine doing the thing that was happening over a sustained period of time. And by doing that and being fully in the present moment, it actually helped me be grounded in the impermanence of everything that arises in our feelings, in our thoughts, in our emotions, and got me through it. To relate it back to sport, that's actually something that I've done pretty frequently when competing as a cyclist. And it's just, hey, okay, I don't think I can sustain this pace any longer. I'm going to blow up. And then just picking some visual object or some number of breaths and being like, I'm going to do this for 5 more breaths. It doesn't always work, but sometimes, you know, everyone around you, when you're in a competitive environment, they likely also don't feel good. Sometimes they do feel a lot better than you. But if you're able to just pick some anchor and dissociate, then you can get through it. And I also would say there's going into your body sometimes is what we need to do to get through a moment. And also, with some of the best advice that I got, my friend Lisa recommended this, and my mom shared this about her cancer experience, because there's so many moments when things are physically happening that it would be your preference to never experience in your entire life. And that can be stuff that's pretty horrifically painful. Like this week, when I knew getting oxaliplatin through a peripheral IV, it feels like having a flamethrower stuck in your arm. And it's like your arm's like a rack of lamb over a fire pit for several hours. And then it hurts like that for a couple of days. Just knowing that's coming, physically feeling it start, it didn't benefit me to go deeper into the feeling or focusing on what was happening.
Yeah.
And yeah, my mom said, hey, like when these things are happening, same thing. Like I've had my throat biopsied a couple of times, which you're conscious for. It's a local anesthetic and a giant needle's being jammed into your neck with someone close in your face. And it's just a bit disconcerting. And my mom said, you know what, just leave your body, like just completely dissociate. And again, going back to Buddhism, you know, there are these concepts or theories of I'm not my feelings, I'm not my thoughts, I'm not my emotions, I'm not myself, like literally I'm not myself, but also I am not my body. And the theory of that, like most theories, is very easy to conceptualize. To actually experience the practice of it is a different thing. And like any skill is something you have to cultivate and to use selectively, because we don't always want to dissociate physically. And it's a way though to survive physical trauma. And sometimes it's all that we can do to get through a moment when our lizard brain is completely dominant, and just like being in a emotional state of terror is not going to be beneficial. And that's helped me to find some calm. And relating it back to sport, again, what is your body telling you when you're going at absolute maximal effort? Or for you, Shannon, when you've been in the ring, you know, like throwing hands with a professional boxer, or, you know, I don't know if you ever got completely flat backed when you were kicking, but it's just like, it's not going to benefit you to be thinking about like the horrific physical thing that's happening to you. You just simply have to set aside that fear and walk through it. So those are some of the lessons that I've learned, and I have many more, and I'll just share a few others. One of which is we don't always control outcomes. Process goals, they're huge now. I feel like it's almost all you hear a lot of NFL coaches talk about. That is an area where you can focus when you have a high degree of uncertainty, like, well, what can you control? For me, in the domain of nutrition, for example, I know that one of the things that in general is beneficial for people going through chemotherapy is to maintain lean muscle mass. For me, that meant having a specific protein target that I work to hit every day, no matter how nauseated I am or how unpalatable food might seem. So it's stuff like that, or moving as much as you can, but also not moving too much, things like that. So what can I control in a situation where there's relatively low control? And I would extend that to learning the ins and outs of what your rights are as a patient and being an informed patient and understanding where you have choices that you may not realize you have during treatment. And that would include medicine is an art and a science, and people learn it through practice. And that means that fellows and residents will be doing some of the procedures that you receive. And also as a patient, you have the right to decline that and to ask for the attending physician to do it. And I don't want to dime anybody out, but I can think of a number of times, like including this week, where this week there were 4 things that happened during a certain visit that really should not have happened. And I'll leave it at that. But you have more control than you might think you have.
Yeah. Yeah. So focusing on the things that you can control and in educating yourself on the extent to which those things exist beyond your own natural behavioral things, what you eat, the thoughts you allow to, move through your consciousness, et cetera. There's also some in the medical landscape, more control than maybe you would appreciate. If you're willing to inform yourself about it.
Yeah, I would say globally also that being a fit and healthy person just globally is highly beneficial. Again, you have much less control. I'm saying you, as in all of us as human beings,
yeah.
We have much less control than we might think we have about what will or won't happen to us with our health and whether or not we can deadlift 400 pounds when we're 110 and all of these things. What you do have the ability to control is just maintaining a baseline of fitness, health, eating a sound diet, because if something / when something does happen that requires your medicalization, you're in a much better position because you'll have few or no comorbidities. And what I've learned about my level of fitness and what I've done to maintain it, the last couple of days, I've been able to do nothing. I'm like lying around in bed and experiencing a lot of side effects. And the deeper I get into treatment, the impacts of chemo are compounding. They're not linear. So it gets more and more intense and the side effects get more intense. Equally, I've worked to be as active as I can. And when I feel okay, I'm going hiking, hour and a half, walking 5 or 6 miles with my ruck, lifting weights when I can. And what that means is that when I do go through treatment, and what I've gathered when doctors say it's really great that you're fit, what they really mean is you can take the maximal amount of punishment that we throw at you. And in the event that our first few keys don't work, you have a much greater chance of being physically able to take more or a different course of treatment. Mm-hmm. Whereas if someone were not fit or they had comorbidities, just the likelihood something could go wrong or that they're not going to be able to try more different things is much higher.
Makes sense. Well, before we wrap, any parting, you're going to laugh if I ask for wisdom because you don't think you're very wise, generally speaking. I disagree, but any parting knowledge bombs to drop? Any last points you'd like to make before we wrap?
Something can happen to anyone at any moment at a time, and that can be a good thing or a bad thing. I think it would benefit all of us to bear in mind that fact and to give ourselves and the people around us some grace when we interact day to day. And I just think the default mode of the world, and in particular, when we see life as a zero-sum game and a competition for resources, which in a lot of environments, you're just in like a pit fight with people to get stuff, resources, things, money. I think finding a way to think with the filter of, can I do whatever needs to be happen and do it in a way that's kind to myself and kind to other people, and that in aggregate relieves the suffering that we all experience, is a valuable way to move through the world. And I love riding my bike. I can't wait to get back on the bike that's behind me and get out there and be even more physically active. I feel really lucky though, as I go through this experience. I have awesome friends like you and a huge community of people who've been incredibly supportive as I've gone through this experience. Feel really lucky because not everyone has that, unfortunately. And in addition to that, I feel really lucky that deep interests of mine are reading, writing, music, my family, parenting, my friends, and mindfulness, because these are domains in which I feel one can always continually foster deeper and greater understanding that are not related to physicality. And as much as I miss being able to experience the world and express my physicality in the ways that I really deeply enjoy, I'm just very grateful that I have all of these other ways to experience the world that are not contingent upon my ability to have a high degree of physical energy right now.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing all of these thoughts today. Thank you for sharing them so freely up to this point on Substack and on Instagram. And thanks for letting me be here to talk about this stuff.
Yeah, thanks for being here, Shannon. And again, you can follow more of my story at HardwayPod on Instagram. You can also subscribe to my Substack. It's alwaysthehardway.substack.com. Find both of those links in bio. And Shannon, once again, where can people find you?
LinkedIn, W. Shannon Jones, and on Substack at TranscendenCEO, which is TranscendenCEO, which is impossible to spell, at Substack.com.
And all right, and I'll see you at the Scratch Cafe in Boulder in probably 2 months.
And you can find me there. Yeah, exactly.
Special thank you to my title sponsor, blockchain.com, your trusted partner on your crypto journey, and to Lauf for making awesome bikes. I look forward to riding mine again on the other side of this cancer experience. And I'm sharing more at HardwayPod on Instagram and on Substack at alwaysthehardway.substack.com. You can find those links in the show notes. The best way to support Choose the Hard Way is to hit 5 stars wherever you listen and to become a paid subscriber to my Substack. Thank you to everyone in this community. That means you, who's reached out to provide positivity, prayers, encouragement, and support during this experience. It's meant everything to me. Please keep them coming. I'd also like to thank Sunlighten, makers of the world's best infrared saunas, for helping make it possible for my family to have an impulse sauna. Being able to relax and recover in our impulse sauna between treatments is healing. It feels like a luxury, and I'm incredibly grateful for Sunlighten's support. I'd also like to thank Peloton of come on, Peloton, let's go, Peloton, you got this fame, for following my cancer experience and surprising me with a Peloton tread. Being able to go to the garage and move on days when it's just too hard for me to get outside during recovery has been huge. I love it. Molly loves it. And we're deeply grateful to Peloton for their generosity. Please share this episode with a friend who knows that hard things build stronger humans who have more fun. And I'll see you next time.